Welcome to the Monday Monologue. This week's topic is something that was kind of a surprise to me, but then after doing some research and thinking about it, it really isn't surprising. One of the things I've done recently is I bought Analog Discovery 2 and installed the Audio Suite software that allows me to do THD measurements, allows me to measure frequency response, and some other things, but those are the two big ones. And one that didn't really shock me was that the frequency response on the amps that I really like the sound of soften up a little bit on the upper end. I'm using clip speakers, which are known for being a little bright, and so it doesn't shock me that the tuning that I've done to amplifiers to tone down the top end brightness would show up on a frequency response. It's not a lot, but it's not a perfectly flat frequency response. It does taper off a little on the top end. But the other part, and let me explain that most of the tuning, or actually all of the tuning that I've done on my amps up to this point and the circuit designs that I've chosen were based on what sounded good to me. I would build an amp, hook it up to my system, listen to some of my favorite music. If it sounded good, then it's good. And if I noticed things that I didn't like, I would make changes and keep moving in a direction that made the amp sound good playing the music that I like. A lot of it's jazz. There's a little bit of rock and roll, like some Elton John and, some other kind of mellower music, not into metal or some of the other really hardcore, super loud rock. I like Heart. There's, several other bands along 70s, 80s vintage stuff. There's some newer stuff I like too. But anyway, I digress that really what I've been doing is tuning to ear, what sounds good. So, and I know there's a couple of amps that I own that I just don't really like the sound of. They just sound just kind of blah. So anyway, when I started running these amps through the audio or the audio analyzer suite, I was kind of surprised that the amps that I really like the sound of have kind of high harmonic distortion, and most of the ones that I really like are in the 1 to 2% range of THD, and the amps that I don't like the sound of, one of them's a solid state and one of them's another tube amp that I built, has really low harmonic distortion, and I just don't like the way they sound. And so that got me to thinking about, why do I like these tube amps that have what some would consider, bordering on high harmonic distortion, or THD. And I found an article, which I'm going to link in the description, that talks about tube sound and THD. And I've come to the conclusion that I like tube sound. And that's why I like tube amps, is I like what they do to the music. I realize that they are coloring the music and that it's not a actual representation of literal what's on the medium or what's on the media, but I like the way it sounds and I enjoy the way it sounds, and that what these tube amps are doing is, some would say artificially, harmonizing the music to, I think, improve what it sounds like over a stereo reproduction of it. And I'm not sure that if the music was actually being played in a music hall, that there wouldn't be this same kind of harmonics in the room that would make the music sound like this. And I know that like some, either studios or venues, because of the harmonics in the room, that they sound better or worse. So maybe that's what's going on. It could be that the room that I've got my speakers in and the way that it, isn't, really set up for as a listening room, that it is just my living room, that having a little distortion in the amp, being a tube amp, and the way that a tube amp actually harmonizes when it's creating harmonic distortion, might sound better to me, and that's the reason. But I'm going to trust my ears, and I'm not going to start tuning my amplifiers to look good on paper and not sound good listening to them. Because at the end of the day, this is mainly for me, and I want to share with you what I'm hearing and what I think sounds good. And some people may not agree, and that's okay. That's why there's all kinds of different ways of skinning a cat. I will say that in the era that I was brought up in the 70s and the 80s, when you were looking at hi-fi gear, you wanted to see like 0.0001% THD, and the lower was the better. And when we're talking about solid state gear, I absolutely agree. Harmonic distortion in a solid state amp sounds terrible, and clipping sounds terrible. And it's one of the reasons we were all conditioned that you need like a 100-watt amplifier, because you didn't want to be using anywhere near the clipping in a solid state amp if you wanted good sound. So even if you only needed 8 or 10 watts, if that, you'd buy a 100-watt amp just so that you knew you were nowhere near where you would be getting any kind of distortion or any kind of clipping in the amp, because we all know how horrible that sounds. Well, tube amp's totally different. And what I'm discovering is that a little bit of harmonic distortion actually improves what a tube amp sounds like and gives you what's called tube sound. Now, I know a lot of people talk all about how they, you need to get a push-pull amp that's got global feedback and that's got the harmonic distortion down to a minimum. And I feel like that then what you're doing is you're getting back to what a solid state amp sounds like. And you're actually missing out on the really pleasant harmonics that a single-ended tube amp adds to the music. So that was just an interesting thing I've learned this week, and kind of shocked me. But on the other hand, after going back and thinking about it, it really does make sense that this harmonic distortion is what makes a tube amp sound like a tube amp. And it's not something that we should be trying to get out of our equipment. It's something we should embrace as part of being what makes it sound like it does. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please subscribe to my channel, like the video, and I'll see you next week for another episode of the Monday Monologue.